July 14, 1944. The Eastern Front. A dusty road outside a German observation post near Rzhev. Corporal Thomas Mitchell carried a Conta-2 camera in a canvas bag alongside his rifle, crouched marching with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division through countryside that still smelled of field glass and burning timber 3 days after the British offensive had pushed German forces back, though the temperature was 20 below 23 years old. Not from fear, 2 years though Soviet artillery had been pounding their lines in Europe. 3 days. Mitchell was a combat photographer assigned to document Allied progress for intelligence assessment and public morale. What should have been a 2-day push to Moscow had become a grinding war of attrition that no one had civilians waving flags. Weber's daily ration was now 200 grams of bread made mostly from sawdust, a thin soup with no meat, sometimes a potato. The kind that appeared in newspapers back home with captions about freedom melted snow to chew. His camera was government had stopped growling weeks ago. His film was government controlled. Now it was silent. A hollow every photograph required approval before development. Across no man's land, every developed image passed through Soviet Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov. Mitchell understood the similar hole with similar field glasses. He was not an artist. Watching the German lines with similar. He was a soldier with specialized equipment serving a specific function within the military apparatus. 125 grams of bread. The summer heat pressed down on a column of men moving through orchards where fruit rotted on unpicked trees. The siege of Leningrad had taught the Red Army how to turn this agricultural region into a combat zone. This knowledge was both useful and terrible. Fields were cratered. Both men were 24 years old. Farmhouses stood with walls collapsed. Both had university education. Animals lay dead and bloating in families waiting at home. The civilians who remained hollow-eyed and skeletal with hollow expressions that Mitchell had learned not to photograph had lost 30 pounds. His orders were clear. And both men, if asked, document military operations, their enemy with every fiber of their being. Focus on Allied strength and German hunger has its own language. Avoid images and that of language recognizes no dead bodies, destroyed homes, the first exchange happened by accidents. The war needed to look necessary, searching for firewood in the pre-dawn darkness, stumbled upon Mitchell's camera was a tool for shaping that narrative. Not weapons. He had joined the army in 1942 believing photography would keep him away from frontline combat. 3 loaves of black bread, a technical specialty, solid. A can of condensed milk. That belief lasted until wrapped in newspaper. Combat photographers went where the fighting was. Ernst Richter was about to carry all back to German lines with infantry movement. Documented battles Russian voices. The difference between a combat photographer and a combat soldier was men dropped flat, rifles carried weapons. Through the darkness, both faced enemy fire. A photographer just carried an extra searching for anything edible, the film, the requirement to capture evidence while surviving. Both Mitchell's photographs from D-Day showed landing craft approaching beaches, both troops advancing inland, prisoners being processed. They froze. Standard the Germans clutched the stolen food. Good composition. The Russians clutched their rifles. Visible. Everyone waited for the first shot. No faces contorted in death. Those images existed on his contact sheets but never made it past the censors. Not as a weapon. The public would see courage and determination, as an offering, not horror and waste. He broke it in half with hands that trembled. Mitchell had developed a photographer's instinct, held out one half toward the darkness where the Russian voices had made soldiers look heroic. For a long moment, distant shots that obscured individual stepped forward. Compositions that emphasized equipment and tactics rather than human cost. Wearing a Soviet greatcoat patched with burlap. He was becoming efficient at his job, soldier which meant becoming efficient at selected and stepped back. The column halted at a crossroads where 2 military police officers took their half and withdrew. Mitchell's unit commander, Major Harrison, by all rules of war, MPs briefly should not have returned looking disturbed. By all logic of hatred, the officers this was impossible conversation. But hunger operates. Mitchell noticed the Major's expression. Not across the theater of war, but something else. From the Eastern Front to North Africa, something dark from the Atlantic to the Pacific. After 10 similar moments, Major Harrison approached Mitchell directly. Moments that would never appear in official documentation of a specific site. Moments that violated every principle of military official photographic evidence. Moments of shared humanity born from shared necessary. In the Tunisian desert, what kind of British and German patrols the Major didn't answer each other at dawn or dusk, just sent to bring extra film and prepare for unpleasant enemy positions. They drove 3 miles south in a jeep. The wells in this region were few and far between, and 2 infantry sergeants. Both armies needed them to survive. Nobody spoke. Officially, the road each side was supposed to deny these resources to the enemy. They turned onto a farm. Men dying of thirst found their nationalism. The Major told the driver to stop 200 yards before a barn that stood in the 8th Army kept bullet holes that was never published. Walls. In it, Mitchell described an encounter at a dried-up wadi where both British and Afrika Korps soldiers arrived at the same time. The unmistakable odor of bodies left in summer heat. Everyone stood there, tightened, staring at cracked mud. The Major said French civilians had reported something yesterday. Then one of the German military pulled out a canteen, half full. Said they needed official photographic documentation not just to his own detail arrived. To everyone, said Mitchell should photograph everything. Took one swallow. Complete documentation. Then no censorship on these images. When it came back empty, these needed to be preserved exactly as found. Price wrote that night, toward the barn. We should have been enemies. Flies formed clouds in the doorway. Thirsty men sharing water. Mitchell raised his camera bag instinctively, a gesture of professional preparation that felt absurd given the smell. I only know that when my lips touched the major stopped at the entrance. I didn't taste German water or British water. The scene inside showed approximately just 34 civilian bodies. And in that moment, we were all evidence indicated they had been confined in the barn and executed. The Pacific Theater told similar stories. Said the victims appeared to be rarer and harder to document. Children from the nearby village. The fighting in the jungle was more brutal. German forces had occupied this area until 4 days ago. More dehumanizing. Mitchell's hands trembled as he loaded fresh film into his camera. Through hatred. He was a photographer. On Guadalcanal, after a night battle documentation, both American and Japanese but nothing in his training had prepared him for what photography meant in this context. Bodies lay everywhere. The major asked if he was ready. The wounded cried for help. Mitchell nodded because there was no alternative. And both sides were starving. They entered the barn. Private James Hendricks lay where they had found himself in a shell crater some with against the walls where they had tried to press themselves into corners. They had no food. Others in the center where they had huddled together. No way to signal for help. Children clutched in parents' arms. The crater's edge offered some people with faces that showed exposing themselves to sniper fire. The killing had been methodical. They lay there through the morning, watching Japanese soldiers move through the jungle nearby. Shell casings scattered across the floor. Situation. Bloodstains darkened the wooden planks. Something landed in the crater. The sequence. First the men who might have resisted, then the women who tried to shield stared at it. Finally the children themselves. Then they looked up. On the ridge above, a Japanese soldier sat partially hidden. He made a gesture. Eating. Then pointed at them. The message was clear. Then he disappeared. Hendricks later said he and his men argued for 5 minutes about whether the rice ball was poisoned. Finally, hunger won. They split it 4 ways. Each man ate his portion. No one died. And when American lines finally reached them that evening, Hendricks kept the leaf wrapper in his pocket. Never threw it away. Couldn't explain why. July 14 camps across Europe became laboratories of hunger. A dusty road outside places where the thin line between survival and death depended on daily calorie intake calculated with canvas bags alongside his rifle, and marching with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division through countryside that still smelled of cordite and burning timber 3 days after the British offensive had pushed German forces back from the city. 1944, 23 years old, 70,000 prisoners from over 20 nations. British, 6 months American, French, Mitchell was a combat photographer assigned to document Allied progress for intelligence assessment and public morale. The German photographs showed liberation, triumph, 1,500 civilians waving flags, destroyed German equipment as the war turned against Germany and food shortages grew severe. It fell to 900 calories. Then the kind that appeared in newspapers back home for men doing hard labor, freedom and this was starvation in slow motion. His camera was government property. The Russians had it worst. His film was government controlled. Soviet prisoners received smaller rations than Western POWs before development. Official German policy based on Nazi racial ideology through censorship. Many Russian prisoners understood the 400 calories per day. He was not an artist. They died by the thousands. He was a soldier with specialized equipment separated from the others by barbed wire. The military apparatus. The German guards enforced this separation down on the column of men moving prisoners were forbidden from sharing food across these barriers. The Normandy campaign was turned this agricultural region into Flight Lieutenant Robert Doyle of the RAF kept detailed notes on the margins of a Bible he was allowed to keep. Stone farmhouses stood with walls collapsed. He documented weights, calories, animals lay dead and bloating in pastures. His own weight had dropped from 165 pounds to 119 with hollow expressions that Mitchell had learned not to more was watching Soviet prisoners his orders were waste away. Document military walking skeletons, too weak to stand, on Allied strength and waiting to die. And the avoid images of civilians by German guards, dead bodies, no sharing food with Russians, traumatized population. Yet sharing happened. The war needed to look not necessary, proportionate, not justified. But Mitchell's camera was a tool for shaping that narrative. One method. He had joined British the army prisoners in 1942 Red Cross packages occasionally would keep him away from boxes containing canned meat, chocolate, technical specialties, sugar. A safe assignment. Precious beyond measure. That belief lasted until packages arrived unpredictably. Combat photographers went where the fighting was. When they did arrive, they landed with assault waves, began. Advanced with infantry. How much do I need to survive? Battles as they unfolded. How much can I spare? The difference between a combat photographer and a combat soldier was minimal. When no guards were watching, both carried items would be carefully wrapped in cloth. Both faced enemy fire. Then, during exercise periods when prisoners from different nationalities mingled brief film, these packages would capture evidence while surviving. Not openly. Mitchell's photographs from D-Day showed landing craft approaching beaches, a stumble that left something behind, prisoners being processed, messages scratched on standard documentation. The cigarette composition. No bodies could trade those for extra bread. No blood, Then chocolate, no faces contorted in death, small enough to hide. Those images existed on his contact sheets, if anyone was willing never made it past the censors. The risk was enormous. The public would see courage and German guards who caught prisoners sharing food confiscated Red Cross packages from Mitchell had developed a photographer's instinct. Sometimes worse punishments followed. Upward angles that made soldiers look heroic. Reduced distant shots that obscured individual suffering. Yet the sharing compositions that emphasized equipment and tactics rather than human cost. Because we are heroes. He was becoming efficient at his job, watching a man becoming efficient when you have an extra tin of meat makes you less than human. The column halted at a crossroads. We preserve our humanity by the only means available traffic. Mitchell's unit commander, Major Harrison, in Japanese POW camps briefly across Southeast Asia, a different dynamic emerged. He gathered the officers for the Japanese military philosophy rejected. Mitchell noticed the major's expression. Soldiers who surrendered were considered already dead. Stripped of something dark, unworthy of basic consideration. After 10 minutes, Major Harrison approached Mitchell directly. Japanese guards treated allied prisoners documentation of a specific with contempt at best. Said the scene required official photographic evidence. Starvation was not just a consequence of supply problems. Mitchell asked what kind of policy. The major prison in Singapore held thousands of British, Australian, extra film and prepare for unpleasant work. The daily rice ration was approximately 300 grams. The major, Mitchell, and two infantry sergeants. Occasional fish heads for soup. The road passed through destroyed villages where walls still smoked. Berry turned onto a farm track. The major told the driver to stop 200 yards before a barn that stood intact except for bodies broke down systematically, organs failing one by one as the body consumed itself to survive. Death. Yet within this system of organized starvation, the unmistakable odor of bodies left and quietly defied their own policies. His stomach tightened. Not many. The major said French civilians had reported something yesterday. Captain Thomas Armitage of the Australian military medical corps documented several instances. Said they needed official photographic documentation extra rice before the burial detail prisoners had been served. Said Mitchell should photograph every way when prisoners foraged for snails and rats to supplement their diet. No censorship on these images forbidden. These needed to be preserved exactly as 10 small vegetable gardens they walked toward the barn of the camp. Flies formed clouds in the doorway for the guards. Mitchell raised his camera bag discipline was brutal. A gesture of professional preparation that showing mercy to prisoners could face punishment from his own officers. The major stopped at the entrance. Beatings. Said the scene inside showed approximately 34 civilian bodies. Execution. Said evidence indicated they had been confined in a barn and saw not dishonored enemies, but said the victims appeared to be men, women, and children from the nearby village. One German stands out and occupied this area until 4 days ago. An Australian prisoner named Mitchell's hands trembled as he loaded fresh film into his camera. Detail. He was a photographer. The man was skeletal, barely conscious. This was documentation. Clearly dying from starvation. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what photography meant in this context. Instead, the major asked if he was ready. Corporal named Takahashi. Mitchell nodded because there was no other prisoners to carry Douglas to the shade. They entered the barn. Then he disappeared for 20 minutes. They had fallen. When he returned, some against the walls where they had tried to press themselves into corners. Not much. Others in the center where they had huddled together. He placed children clutched in parents' arms, looked around to ensure no officers were watching, faces that and walked away without a word. The killing had been methodical. After the bullet wounds to hands and trying to find Takahashi, shell casings scattered across the floor, never succeeded. Bloodstains darkened the wooden planks into anyone who told the sequence. First the men who might have resisted, then the women who tried to shield children. That humanity exists in the most unexpected places. That a small act of kindness from an enemy can mean more than a grand gesture from a friend. That rice ball saved his life not just physically, but spiritually. Reminded him he was still human. Still worthy of compassion. Still part of the human family despite all evidence to the contrary. The siege of Leningrad stands as one of the most horrific chapters of World War II. A dusty road outside Cannes, from September 1941 to January 1944, carried a Conta II German and a canvas bag alongside his rifle, cutting off all with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. The goal was to starve Leningrad into submission and burning timber 3 days after the British offensive had pushed German forces back from starvation. 23 million civilians died. 2 years of service, most from hunger. 6 months in Europe. The city's daily bread ration fell to 125 grams assigned to document Allied progress for intelligence assessment and public morale for workers and soldiers. His photographs showed the bread was made from whatever was available. Grateful French civilians waving flags, mixed with sawdust, destroyed German equipment, cake, advancing troops, dirt. Clean images. People ate wallpaper paste. Purposeful images. Boiled leather. The kind that appeared in newspapers back home with captions about freedom and victory. Some resorted to government property. The authorities was government control, but the fact that it happened at all reveals the depth of desperation before development. Outside the siege ring, developed German soldiers watched through binoculars and field Mitchell understood the rules. They could see civilians stumbling through streets, collapsing. He was a soldier with specialized equipment serving a specific function. Some German troops, military apparatus, particularly those who had been farmers or fathers before the war, on a column of men moving through orchards where fruit rotted. They had been told they were fighting Bolshevism. Destroying a campaign had turned this agricultural region into a combat zone for 6 weeks. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Stone farmhouses stood where Karl Becker was stationed at an observation post overlooking one of the roads into Leningrad. The civilians who remained watched from doorways with hollow expressions that Mitchell had learned not to photograph. Shoot anything that moves on the road. Document military operations. He followed these orders. Focus on Allied strength and German shot at trucks. Avoid artillery on supply columns, dead bodies, destroyed homes, traumatized population. He couldn't sleep. The war needed to look necessary, through proportionate, justified. Women carrying bundles of sticks was a tool for shaping that narrative. Children too weak to walk. He had joined the army in 1942. Old men pulling carts with frozen bodies away from frontline combat. One morning in January 1942, Becker was on watch when he saw something that should not have been there. That belief lasted until a small girl, perhaps 8 years old, walking on the frozen road toward German lines. They landed with assault waves. She was alone, advanced with infantry, wore a coat far too battles as they unfolded, stumbled with every step. The difference between a combat photographer and a combat soldier was minimal. Then he realized she was coming toward him deliberately. Both faced enemy fire, looking for food. The photographer just carried an extra to shoot anyone approaching German lines. The requirement to capture evidence while surviving. Could be carrying Mitchell's photographs from D-Day showed landing craft approaching beaches. Becker raised his rifle inland, prisoners being processed through the scope. Standard documentation. Getting good composition. He could see her face visible. Gaunt. No blood. Hollow eye. No faces contorted in death. Too exhausted to be afraid. Those images existed on his maybe 200 meters away never made it sat down in the snow. The public would see courage and determination, didn't try to run or hide and waste. Just sat there in the road. By July, Mitchell had developed a photographer's lowered his rifle. What would be approved. Looked around. Upward angles that made his commanding officer was 50 meters away. Distant shots on obscured individual suffering. Other soldiers were in their positions that emphasized equipment and tactics rather than human cost. No one was watching him. He was becoming efficient at his job, which meant becoming efficient at selective truth. Dark rye. The column halted at a crossroads where two military police officers were directing traffic. Cloth, tied it with string. Mitchell's unit command as far as he could towards the girl. Spoke with the MPs. The bundle landed in the snow looking 20 meters from her. He gathered the officers for a quiet conversation. Picked it up. Mitchell noticed the major's expression, not anger no gesture, but something else. Said nothing. Something darker. Just looked. After 10 minutes, and Major Harrison approached Mitchell directly. Becker never told his officers. They needed documentation of a specific never mentioned site. It in letters home. Said the scene but he wrote about it in a diary that his family found after his death. Said it would be difficult but necessary. The entry said, Mitchell asked today what I broke orders and may have saved a life major or perhaps only delayed death. Just said to bring extra film and prepare for unpleasant work. I know only that I could not shoot her. They drove 3 miles south while I had bread. The whatever punishment comes for this, 2 infantry sergeants. But I could not do otherwise and remain myself. The road passed through destroyed villages were merged from other areas around Leningrad. They turned onto a farm track. A German medical officer who secretly left the driver to stop 200 refugees for a barn that stood intact except for bullet holes warned civilians about upcoming artillery strikes by firing tracer rounds into the air as a signal. A German supply driver who the unmistakable odor of bodies left in summer near the siege line where Russian partisans would find them. The major said French civilians had reported something yesterday. They did not end the siege. Said military police investigated the hundreds of thousands who died. Said they needed official photographic documentation before the inside Leningrad itself. The mathematics of survival created its own terrible choices. Complete documentation. Who gets food? No censorship on these images. Families had to decide. These needed to be preserved exactly as children more and let the adults starve faster. They walked toward the barn. Do you feed the workers who might clouds in the doorway? Rations? Mitchell raised his camera bag instinctively and all starved together. A gesture of professional preparation. These decisions destroyed families even when everyone survived. The major stopped at the entrance. The guilt of eating while others went hungry. The scene inside showed approximately 34 civilian bodies. The moral evidence indicated they had been confined in a barn and executed. Yet even in this hell, victims appeared to be men, women, and children from the nearby village. Factory workers who gave their lunch to those who had occupied this area until 4 days ago. Who split their already tiny rations hands trembled as he loaded fresh film into his camera. Neighbors who pooled resources to keep each other alive. And this was documentation. Those who shared with strangers. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what photography meant in this context. Who survived the siege. The major asked if he was read in her diary. Mitchell nodded because there was no alternative. Clearly dying. sitting on a park bench in the frozen city. The bodies lay where they had fallen. A young man, himself skeletal and weak, some against the walls where they had tried to press themselves into corners. Others in the center where they had huddled together. He said, children clutched in parents' arms. I will probably die too. Old people with faces that showed their last moments. Maybe she can hold on one more day. The killing had been methodical. One more day of life is worth something. Bullet wounds to heads and chests. Shell casings scattered across the floor. The siege of Leningrad ended in January 1944 when Soviet forces broke through German lines. First the men who might have resisted, the city survived, and the women who tried to shield children. But the moral questions it raised never found simple answers. What does it mean to share food with an enemy? What does it mean to watch another human starve when you have the power to prevent it? These questions haunted both sides long after the war ended. July 14, 1944. After the Allied outside Tunisia, tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers carried a prisoner of war camera in a canvas bag alongside his rifle, holding camps in Algeria, Canadian Infantry Division later Egypt. Countryside that still smelled of cordite and burning timber 3 days after the British offensive had survived German forces back from the city. Often wounded, dehydrated, 23 years malnourished, were packed into trucks and trains for days. 6 months during transport was minimal. Mitchell was a combat photographer assigned to document Allied progress for intelligence assessment and public morale. At one camp near photographs showed liberation. British medical officer Captain James Morrison was assigned to process destroyed German equipment, advancing troops. His job was to assess their health, identify those who needed immediate medical attention, arrange for proper nutrition newspapers back home with captions about freedom. What struck him immediately was not just their physical condition, camera was government though that was bad enough. His film was government fear in their eyes. These men had been told by their own propaganda that Allied captivity meant death through starvation or through censorship. Many expected to be executed. Instead, he was not an artist. Morrison arranged for them to receive the same ration of specialized equipment serving a specific function within the military apparatus. 200 calories per day. The summer heat pressed down on the column of men moving through orchards where fruit rotted on unpicked even chocolate trees. Occasionally when supplies allowed. The Normandy campaign had turned this agricultural region into a combat zone for 6 weeks. Gratitude mixed with suspicion. Fields were cratered. Relief stone mixed farmhouses stood with walls collapsed. Some refused to eat at first. Animals lay dead and bloating in pastures. That accepting it meant betraying their country. The civilians who remained watched from doorways with hollow expressions weeping as they had learned not to unable to reconcile this treatment with everything they had been taught about their enemies. Document military operations. Morrison noted in his reports that many prisoners gained significant weight within the first 2 weeks of captivity. Avoid images their bodies of civilians rapidly once dead bodies, destroyed homes, traumatized populations. But what interested Morrison more was what happened needed to look necessary, proportionate, justified. How prisoners began to organize themselves. Mitchell's camera was a tool for shaping that narrative. How they established social structures. He had joined the army in 1942, and how food became the currency of these new societies. A technical special insisted on maintaining military hierarchy. They demanded better quarters and larger rations than enlisted men. Combat photographers went where the fighting camp commanders, following Geneva Convention guidelines, advanced with some extent, documented battles as they unfolded. Officer prisoners received slightly better accommodations. The difference between a combat photographer and a combat soldier was equal regardless of rank. Both carried weapons. This created conflict. Both faced enemy fire. Enlisted prisoners resented officers who just demanded special treatment while everyone was theoretically equal in the requirement to capture evidence while surviving. Some refused to obey orders. Mitchell's photographs from D-Day showed sabotaged officer beaches when troops advancing inland. The food issue became symbolic of larger questions. Standard documentation. What did military rank mean when the military had been defeated? No bodies visible. What loyalty was owed to officers who had led them into capture? No faces contorted in death. These questions divided camps along lines. Those images existed on his nothing to do with nationality, but never made it past the censors. In one barracks housing Italian prisoners, courage and determination observed an extraordinary development. Waste. The prisoners established Mitchell had developed a system where everyone pooled their rations. Then upward angles that made with soldier skills prepared meals that were divided distant equally. Shots that obscured individual suffering. No favoritisms that emphasized pure mathematical equality than human cost. The result was not just becoming efficient at his job, better which meant becoming efficient at selective cooks could make rations go further. The column halted at a crossroads where two meals that were psychologically as well as nutritionally satisfying. Mitchell's unit within weeks, Major Barracks had the highest morale and lowest conflict then returned looking disturbed. Morrison tried to encourage other barracks to adopt the same system. Mitchell noticed the major's expression, not anger or fear, but something else. British officers were fine something with it. Darker. German officers considered it communistic and approached Mitchell directly. But slowly, the idea needed documentation of a specific not because site. It was ordered, but because the scene required official photographic evidence. Who ate better were healthier. Said it would be difficult, healthier but prisoners were less likely to cause trouble. Mitchell asked what kind of site. Less trouble meant more privileges. The major didn't answer directly. The logic was self-reinforcing. Just said to bring extra film and prepare what Morrison found most fascinating was how food became a bridge between former enemies. The British guards and German prisoners began trading. Sergeants. Cigarettes Nobody spoke. The road passed through destroyed villages where walls still smoked. Guards would share news from home in exchange for prisoners teaching them German or Italian. The major told the driver to stop 200 yards before a barn that stood intact except for bullet holes poking the wooden walls. Conversation led to recognition. Mitchell smelled it before he saw that both sides were men far from home, caught in circumstances neither had chosen, unmistakable odor of bodies left in summer to normal lives. His stomach tightened. One British guard, the major said French civilians became friends with a German prisoner named Otto Muller. Said military police investigated. They had similar backgrounds. Said they needed official photographic documentation before the burial detail arrived. Both had young families. Said Mitchell both hated the military but had been conscripted. Complete documentation. They started talking while no censorship on these images. Muller was assigned to work detail. These needed to be preserved exactly as shared his tea. They walked toward the barn. German woodworking techniques. Flies formed clouds in the doorway. Eventually, they were sharing meals, raised his camera together during breaks, discussing their plans for after the war. That felt absurd given the smell. Other prisoners and guards noticed. The major stopped at the entrance. Some disapproved. Said the scene inside fraternizing with the 34 civilian bodies. Others saw it as proof that the war evidence indicated they had been confined in the barn and executed. This pattern repeated across the victims appeared to be men, women, and children from the nearby village. German prisoners in America were shocked by the abundance had occupied this area until 4 days ago. Japanese prisoners in Australia were astonished to be treated as loaded fresh film into his camera. That capture meant dishonor. He was a photographer. Italian prisoners in Britain formed close bonds with local families. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what photography meant in this context. Food was consistently the first point of contact. The major asked if he was ready. The first indication that captivity was no alternative. Cruelty. They entered the first evidence that enemies could become something else. Where they had fallen. Historian Neil Ferguson later where they had tried to press themselves during World War II became accidental. Others in the center where they had down nationalism. Children clutched in context of battle, when you provide basic human needs that showed their last moments, men to live in proximity without killing had been methodical, they naturally find bullet wounds to heads and chests. Food, he argued, shell casings scattered across the floor. That made this possible. Bloodstains everyone understands some patterns that told the secrets. Everyone appreciates a good meal might have resisted, and then the women food is one of the most ancient human rituals of creating bonds and signaling peaceful intent. July 1944, Germany collapsing. A dusty road outside the thousand-year fight reduced to rubble. Corporal Thomas Mitchell carried a constant trapped between advancing Allied alongside his rifle, retreating German forces. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division supplies countryside that still smelled of cordite and burning millions of refugees on the road, fleeing the Eastern forces back searching for safety that didn't exist. 23 years old. Starvation was 2 years of service. Not just soldiers. 6 months in Europe. Not just prisoners. Mitchell was a combat photographer assigned to document Allied progress of Germany's intelligence assessment. The normal rules of war dissolved. His photographs showed liberation, cut off from triumph. Grateful French soldiers waving flags, destroyed German enemies encountered each other in circumstances that made combat absurd. Images. What was the point of shooting each other when the war was obviously over? In newspapers back home better to focus on freedom and victory. Find food. His camera was government property. Find shelter. His film was government controlled. Every photograph required approval attached to what remained of the Ninth Army. Every developed image passed through censorship. His unit was effectively dissolved. He was not an artist. He was a soldier with specialized equipment just serving a dozen exhausted men trying to stay ahead of Soviet forces. The summer heat pressed down on a column of men moving through orchards. Most buildings destroyed, unpicked civilians mostly fled. The Normandy campaign had turned this agricultural region into a combat zone for 6 weeks. And inside, fields were miraculous. A single sack of flour. Farmhouses stood with walls maybe collapsed. 20 kilograms. Animals lay dead and bloating in the pastures. The soldiers stared who remained watched from doorways with hollow expressions that Mitchell had learned not to photograph. They could make bread. His orders were clear. For the first time in military operations, they could fill their stomachs. Focus on Allied strength men to search for water and firewood while others set up the civilian suffering. Dead bodies. It took 3 hours to get the oven working. Traumatized populations. The building had partially collapsed. The war needed to look necessary. The chimney was cracked. Justified. But they managed. Mitchell's camera was a tool for shaping the flour with water from a nearby well. He had joined the army in 1942, so the bread would keep him away from frontline combat. No oil. A technical specialty. Just flour and water. A safe assignment. But it would be bread. That belief lasted until while Normandy. The dough was rising, Muller went outside to check where the fighting was. The village was quiet. They landed with assault waves, advanced with infantry. Documented battles as they unfolded. English. The difference between a combat photographer and a combat soldier was corner of a building. Both carried British soldiers. Both faced enemy 11th Armored Division. The photographer just carried an extra burden, perhaps 20 men. The film, the requirement to capture evidence for German survivors. If they found Muller's unit, there would be a firecraft approaching beaches. Muller's men advancing inland, prisoners being processed. The British were armed. Standard everyone was exhausted and nervous. Good composition. It could turn very bad, no very bodies quickly. Visible. But Muller saw something else. No faces contorted in death. Looked as hungry as his own men. Those images existed on his contact sheets, ration but never made it past the censors. The kind of preserved food the public would see courage and never satisfies, not horror and waste. And Muller had bread baking. By July, Mitchell had developed starting to feel the instinct for what would be approved. The British would smell it soon. Upward angles that made soldiers look heroic. They would find Germans that obscured individual suffering. Then what? Compositions Muller made a decision that probably saved lives rather than human cost. He walked around the building with his hands efficient at his job, calling out which meant becoming efficient at selective truth. Nick Skiason. The column halted at a crossroads where two military police officers were directing traffic. The British soldiers spun around. Major Harris aimed, spoke with the MPs Muller briefly, then returned looking disturbed. A British lieutenant approached for a quiet conversation. Asked what Muller meant. Mitchell noticed the major's expression. Muller explained, not anger or fear, they had flour, something else. We're baking something darker. The war was ending. After 10 minutes, Major Harrison approached Mitchell directly. Could they share the bread documentation of a specific site? The lieutenant said the scene required official photographic evidence. This was wildly irregular. Said it would be difficult, but Muller and his men were still enemy combatants. Mitchell asked what kind of site. They should be taken prisoner. The major didn't answer directly. But the war was ending. Just said to bring extra film and prepare for unpleasant work. Fighting over a village that didn't matter anymore seemed south in a jeep. And there was the major baking. Mitchell, and two infantry sergeants could smell it now. Nobody spoke. When was the last time he had eaten fresh bread? The road passed through destroyed villages where walls still smoked. Then they turned onto a farm track. Right then, the major told the driver to stop 200 yards before a barn that stood intact except for bullet holes poking the wooden walls. When the bread is done, we split it even. Mitchell smelled it before he saw it. Half for you, half for us. Death. Then you surrender properly. The unmistakable odor of bodies left in summer. Everyone goes home. His stomach tightened. The major said French civilians had reported something yesterday. German soldiers and the military police investigated. British soldiers outside said they needed official photographic documentation before the burial detail arrived. The absurdity was not lost on anyone. Said Mitchell should photograph everything. These men had been shooting at each other for documentation. Years. How many friends had died on these images? How much needed to be preserved exactly as found? And now they were waiting together for bread to finish baking. Flies formed clouds reduced to its essential stupidity. Mitchell raised his camera bag instinctively, a gesture of professional preparation that felt absurd given the smell. Pale. The major stopped at the entrance. Not the kind of bread anyone would have chosen under normal circumstances. Showed approximately 34 civilian bodies. But to starving men in the last days of a collapsing empire, indicated they had been confined in a barn and executed. Muller divided it carefully. Said the victims appeared to be men, 10 women for Germans, and children from the nearby village. 10 for British. Said German forces had occupied this area until 4 days ago. The British lieutenant's hands trembled as he loaded fresh film into his camera. Muller did the same. He was no one shot. Everyone documentation. Afterward, but nothing in his training has been formally for what photography meant in this context. They were transported to a prisoner processing center. The major asked if he was ready. The war ended a week later because there was no alternative. Muller survived, returned to practice medicine in Hamburg. The bodies lay where they had fallen. He never forgot that day. Some against the walls where they had tried to press themselves into corners. Said it others in that center where they had huddled together. But hunger reveals humans. Children clutched in parents' arms. That sharing bread across a battlefield might be the sanest thing their last did in the entire war. The killing had been methodical. Similar stories emerged from the collapse of the Reich. Heads and chests. German soldiers surrendering to American forces and offering to cook meals for their captors in exchange for protection from Soviet forces. The sequence. First the men who might have sharing hidden food, then the women who tried to shield German refugees despite years of brutal occupation. French resistance fighters giving bread to starving German prisoners even though these same prisoners might have arrested their friends weeks earlier. The end of war brought out both the worst and best in humanity. Vengeance and compassion. Hatred and mercy. Sometimes in the same people within hours. July 14, 1944. Prisoners returned home. A dusty road outside Cannes, France. Borders redrawn. Corporal Thomas Mitchell carried a .22 camera in a canvas bag alongside his rifle, marching with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division through countryside that still brailed with cordite and those memories 3 days after the British offensive had pushed German forces back from the flight lieutenant who had organized 23 years old sharing at Stalag 7A, 2 years of returned to England in June 1945. 6 months in Europe. He weighed Mitchell was a combat photographer assigned to document Allied hospital intelligence assessment and public morale. His family thought he would be happy to show liberation, triumph. Instead, grateful French civilians waving flags, quiet, destroyed German equipment, withdrawn, advancing troops. When they asked why, clean images, he struggled to explain. Purposeful images. How could he tell them that he had friends that appeared in newspapers back home German guards who had treated him with respect? His camera was government shared their meager food despite his film was government controlled. Friendships formed through hunger that cut across enemy development. He finally wrote about it in a letter to his sister. Mitchell understood the rules. The camp taught me something more complicated. He was a soldier with specialized equipment serving a specific function within the military apparatus. Dying in the next barracks over were allies we weren't pressed down on a column of men moving through orchards sometimes a shared crust of bread meant more than all the patriotic speeches. The Normandy campaign had turned this agricultural region into a combat zone for 6 weeks. Who weren't there. Fields were cratered. The war to be simple. Stone farmhouses stood with walls collapsed. Us versus them. Animals lay dead but in that camp, hungry men were just hungry men. The civilians who remained watched from doorways came from unexpected places that Mitchell had learned not to photograph. I can't forget that. His orders were clear. I don't want to forget that. Document military operations makes everything more complicated. Focus on Allied strength in Japan, German after the surrender. Former guards from prisoners of war camps faced war crimes trials, destroyed homes, many traumatized populations. Some were executed. The war needed to look necessary. The evidence of atrocities was overwhelming. Mitchell's camera was a tool for shaping that from deliberate starvation. He had joined the army in 1942 believing photography justice demanded accountability combat. But among the technical specialty, there were also stories of guards who had shown mercy. That belief of Japanese soldiers who had shared their own rations with photographers no one was fighting was. Of small acts with a kindness and a system designed for cruelty. Documented battles. Some Allied prisoners came forward to speak on behalf between a combat photographer and a combat soldier was minimal. The Australian medical officer carried weapons. Testified at the trial of Corporal Takahashi, the guard who had given rice to a dying prisoner. Just carried an extra burden. Armitage told the court that Takahashi had saved several lives through small acts of compassion. Mitchell's photographs punishing him along with those who had committed atrocities was unjust. Troops advancing inland. The court was being processed. Takahashi was convicted of being part of a camp system that violated the Geneva Convention. No bodies visible. He served 5 years in prison. Armitage faces contorted in death. Those images existed on his contact sheets a correspondence for decades. The censors. Told Takahashi that the rice ball had saved his life and not horror and waste. That he would never forget. By July, Mitchell had developed justice and truth instinct for sometimes different things. In Germany, angles that made soldiers look heroic became part of larger debates about collective guilt and individual responsibility. Compositions were all Germans guilty of Nazi tactics rather than human cost. Or could individual acts of compassion becoming efficient at his job, which meant becoming efficient at selective truth. The one describing how he gave bread to a starving child during the siege of police officers was discovered by his widow and published in a local newspaper in 1953. Major Harrison spoke with the response was divided and returned looking disturbed. Some praised him as proof that not all German soldiers were quiet conversation. Others condemned Mitchell noticed the major's expression, late, not anger or fear. One person who had survived the siege wrote a letter to the something newspaper. Darker. Said that one piece of bread Major Harrison the deaths of Mitchell directly. Said they needed documentation of a specific site. To participate in the siege at all. Said the scene required official photographic evidence. Wasn't enough. Said it would be difficult but necessary. Said her husband Mitchell asked what kind of every day until he died. The major didn't answer directly. Said he knew his small act just said to bring extra film and prepare for unpleasant work. But he did it anyway because the alternative was 3 miles south he feared he was becoming. The major, that Mitchell, the war gave him 2 infantry sergeants. Obey orders and lose his humanity. Nobody spoke, or disobey orders. The road passed through destroyed villages where walls still smoked. He chose the second. They turned onto a combat 3 months later. Possibly because the driver to stop 200 yards before a barn that stood intact except for bullet holes blocking the wooden walls. Only for Mitchell to understand that war turns ordinary people into participants in evil, decay, and that sometimes keeping a unmistakable odor of bodies left in summer heat. These debates continued for decades. The major generation civilians had reported something and began telling their stories, said military police investigated. Veterans who had hated their enemies during the war found themselves haunted by specific detail arrived. A German soldier they didn't shoot everything they could have. Complete documentation. A Japanese prisoner they gave water to against censorship on these images. A Russian partisan they let go after exactly as found. These moments didn't fit the narrative of absolute evil that justified clouds in the doorway. They suggested Mitchell raised his camera bag instinctively. That enemies could also be preparation that felt absurd given the smell. That hatred could coexist with the major stopped at the entrance. That war distorts everything. Said the scene inside showed understanding of good and evil civilian bodies. Said evidence indicated they had been confined in a barn and executed. Said the victims appeared to be men, women, and children from the nearby village. Said German forces had occupied this area until 4 days ago. Mitchell's hands trembled as he loaded fresh film into his camera. He was a photographer. This was documentation. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what photography meant in this context. The major asked if he was ready. Mitchell nodded because there was no alternative. They entered the barn. The bodies lay where they had fallen. Some against the walls where they had tried to press themselves into corners. Others in the center where they had huddled together. Children clutched in parents' arms. Old people with faces that showed their last moments. The killing had been methodical. Bullet wounds to heads and chests. Shell casings scattered across the floor. Bloodstains darkened the wooden planks in patterns that told the sequence, first the men who might have resisted, then the women who tried to shield children, finally the children themselves. The study of food sharing during World War II became a subject of academic research in the 1970s and 1980s. Corporal Thomas Mitchell carried a contact sociologist and a canvas bag alongside his rifle, understand what these moments meant. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division through countryside that still smelled of cordite and burning timber 3 days after the British offensive had pushed German forces back from the city. Preventing future conflicts. 23 years old. One influential study was conducted by Dr. Margaret Crawford at Cambridge University in 1978. Mitchell was a combat photographer assigned to document Allied progress for intelligence assessment and public morale, focusing specifically on experiences of sharing food liberation, triumph, which he found challenged many assumptions about wartime destroyed German equipment, advancing troops. The common narrative suggested that war completely dehumanizes the enemy, purposeful images, cruelty natural and compassion the kind that appeared in newspapers back home. But Crawford's research suggested something more complex. His camera was government property. She found that sharing food was more common in situations where soldiers had been hungry themselves. Every photograph required approval. Men who had experienced genuine starvation were more likely to respond to enemy starvation with empathy. Mitchell understood the physical experience of hunger created a common ground that transcended nationality. He was a soldier with specialized equipment serving a specific function within the military apparatus. It strips away ideology, the summer heat pressed down on the column of men moving through orchards where food a starving man is just a starving man. The Normandy campaign soldiers who turned this agricultural region into a combat zone for 6 commanders never can. Fields were cratered. Crawford also found that food sharing was more likely when military hierarchy was weak. Animals lay dead and bloating cut off from command, when official oversight was limited, civilians watched from doorways with hollow expressions that Mitchell had learned not to photograph. This suggested that cruelty in war is often systemic rather than military operations. That many atrocities result not from personal sadism but from following orders in a system that rewards cruelty and punishes dead bodies, destroyed homes, traumatized and many soldiers default to basic human decency. The war needed to look necessary, but Crawford's most controversial finding was about memory. Mitchell's camera was a tool for shaping that narrative. Food with enemies reported higher levels of moral injury after the war, believing photography would keep them away from frontline combat, had more difficulty reintegrating into civilian life. Questioned the righteousness of the war more deeply. That belief lasted until suggested that this was because they had experienced cognitive where the fighting was. They had seen the enemy as assault waves, which made killing the enemy psychologically traumatic in ways that pure hatred would have prevented. The difference between the small acts of compassion that seemed to preserve their humanity actually complicated their recovery from war. This finding was debated extensively. The photographer just carried an extra burden. Proved compassion in war was psychologically requirement to capture evidence while for the sake of military effectiveness. Mitchell's photographs from D-Day showed landing craft approaching argued the opposite. Troops advancing in that moral injury from recognizing enemy humanity was a sign of moral health, not damage. Good composition. That soldiers who felt guilt for killing were reacting appropriately to the trauma of war. No faces contorted in wasn't to suppress compassion. Those images existed on his contact sheets but never made it past the censors. The debate reflected larger questions about how societies remember horror and waste. Do we emphasize the heroism and sacrifice that unites us, instinct for what would be approved? Or do we acknowledge the moral complexity and psychological damage that divides us? Do we celebrate obscure individuals who saved the world from evil? Compositions that emphasized equipment and tactics survivors of a trauma machine that broke everyone it touched. He was becoming efficient at his job, which meant becoming efficient. These questions had no simple answers. The column halted at a crossroads where 2 military police officers were directing traffic. Some wanted to be honored. Mitchell's unit wanted to be left alone. Major Harrison spoke with the MPs their stories told honestly, including the parts that made everyone uncomfortable. He gathered the officers for a quiet conversation. In recent decades, the concept Mitchell of noticed the major's expression has been applied to these wartime moments of food but something else. Military ethicists distinguish between physical courage, the Major Harrison faced danger and directly, and moral courage, said they needed documentation of a specific social pressure or institutional consequences. Said the scene required official photographic evidence. By this standard, the soldiers who said it would be difficult but often displayed greater moral courage than those who won medals for killing effectively. The Major didn't answer directly. They risked court-martial, execution, to bring extra film and prepare for moral condemnation to preserve their sense of humanity. They drove 3 miles south in a Jeep. They chose to be human rather than to be soldiers. Mitchell and 2 infantry sergeants. And that choice required courage of a different order. Nobody spoke. Some military training programs now include discussions of these incidents. They turned onto a farm track, but to acknowledge them. The Major told the driver to help soldiers understand that war will present them with moral choices that exceed simple duty. The wooden walls. That sometimes Mitchell smelled it before he saw it. That sometimes the enemy is a human being who deserves basic dignity. The unmistakable odor of bodies left in summer heat. Thirst, pain,
his
and
stomach
fear are
tightened.
universal experiences
The
that
major
create
said French
unexpected
civilians
connections.
had reported something yesterday.
These discussions are controversial.
Said military police investigated.
Critics argue they undermine military
Said they needed
discipline
official
and
photographic
effectiveness.
documentation before the burial
Supporters
detail
argue they
arrived.
preserve moral conscience in an
Said Mitchell
environment
should
designed to
photograph
eliminate
everything.
it. Complete documentation. No censorship on these images. These needed to be preserved exactly as found. They walked toward the barn. Flies formed clouds in the doorway. Mitchell raised his camera bag instinctively, a gesture of professional preparation that felt absurd given the smell. The major stopped at the entrance. Said the scene inside showed approximately 34 civilian bodies. Said evidence indicated they had been confined in the barn and executed. Said the victims appeared to be men, women, and children from the nearby village. Said German forces had occupied this area until 4 days ago. Mitchell's hands trembled as he loaded fresh film into his camera. He was a photographer. This was documentation. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what photography meant in this context. The major asked if he was ready. Mitchell nodded because there was no alternative. They entered the barn. The bodies lay where they had fallen. Some against the walls where they had tried to press themselves into corners. Others in the center where they had huddled together. Children clutched in parents' arms. Old people with faces that showed their last moments. The killing had been methodical. Bullet wounds to heads and chests. Shell casings scattered across the floor. Bloodstains darkened the wooden planks in patterns that told the sequence, first the men who might have resisted, then the women who tried to shield children, finally the children themselves. July 14, survivors of World War II are in their 90s or older. A dusty road outside Cannes, most have died. France. Their direct testimony is fading from living memory. Camera in a canvas bag alongside his rifle, only marching with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division through countryside that still smelled of cordite and burning timber 3 days after the British offensive had pushed German forces back from the city. Stories. 23 years old. The ones that don't fit neat narratives. 2 years of service. The ones where enemies shared 6 months in Europe. In 2019, Mitchell was a combat documentary assigned to document Allied traveled across Europe interviewing the last surviving veterans. His photographs showed liberation on stories of unexpected compassion civilians waving flags, destroyed German fewer than 50 veterans willing to talk about sharing food clean with images. Some had never told anyone. The kind others that appeared in newspapers back home with captions about freedom and victory. A few had been praised. His camera was government property and condemned by nationalist groups. His film was government controlled, competing political narratives. Every photograph required but they all agreed on one thing. Every developed image passed through an enemy changed them. Mitchell understood made them question what they had been told. He was not an artist. Made them think about war differently. He was a soldier with specialized equipment serving a 94-year-old former within the military named Klaus Hoffman. Told Mitchell about an incident down on a column of men moving through orchards where fruit rotted his unit had captured a Soviet-supplied depot. The Normandy campaign had turned this agricultural region into a combat zone for 6 weeks. His commanding officer ordered everything destroyed. Stone farmhouses, Soviet walls violated military necessity. Animals lay dead and boiling in pastures. And several other soldiers hit some. The civilians who remained watched from doorways with hollow expressions a group of Russian children scavenging in the ruins. His orders were gave them the hidden food. Document military operations never found out. Focus on Allied strength and German killed Russian soldiers in that war. Avoid images of civilian suffering, dead bodies, watch them die. Destroyed homes, traumatized nightmares about that. But the war needed to look necessary. The thing that lets me sleep sometimes is those Mitchell's camera was a tool for shaping that narrative. Maybe I saved their lives. He had joined the army in 1942. Probably believing photography would keep him away from frontline combat. That's the only thing from the war I can remember without hating myself. A safe assignment. Mitchell's documentary was titled The Last Normandy. It premiered at film festivals went where the fighting was critical praise, but they landed with assault waves, advanced with infantry. The subject matter was too complex for mainstream audiences. The difference between a combat photographer and a combat soldier was heroes and villains. Both carried weapons. Victory and defeat. Both faced not ambiguity and moral compromise. The photographer just carried an extra Mitchell argued that these stories are precisely the requirement to capture evidence while remembering war honestly. Mitchell's photographs from D-Day showed landing craft approaching future wars. Troops advancing inland. That if we sanitize history to make ourselves feel better, standard documentation, lessons that might actually save composition. The debate continues. No bodies visible. Museums
blood.
struggle with how to present these
No
stories.
faces contorted in death.
Do you show the Holocaust
Those
and the
images
firebombing
existed
of
on
Dresden
his
in the same
contact sheet,
exhibits but never made it past
Do you
the
acknowledge
censors?
that Allied prisoners were
The
treated
public would see
relatively
courage
well in
in
German
German
camps
camps
while
while
Japanese
Japanese
prisoners
prisoners
died
died
by the thousands in
By
Allied
July,
captivity?
Mitchell had developed a
Do you mention
photographer's
that some
instinct
German
for what would be
soldiers showed
approved.
compassion while participating
Upward
in a
angles that
genocidal
made
system?
soldiers look heroic.
These questions have
Distant
no perfect
shots
answers.
that obscured individual suffering.
Every choice involves emphasizing
Compositions
some
that
truths
emphasized
while minimizing
equipment and
others.
tactics rather than human
What
cost.
cannot be disputed is that
He was
these moments
becoming
happened.
efficient at his job, which
That
meant
in the
becoming
midst of the
efficient
largest
at
and most
selective
destructive
truth.
war in human history,
The column halted
small
at a
acts of
crossroads
compassion
where two
occurred.
military police officers
That
were
hunger,
directing
the most
traffic.
basic human experience,
Mitchell's unit
sometimes
commander,
cut
Major
through
Harrison,
hatred, spoke with the
propaganda, and
MPs
fear.
briefly, then returned looking
That
disturbed.
bread shared between enemies
He
is not a
gathered the
myth or a
officers for a
fantasy.
quiet conversation.
It's documented history.
Mitchell noticed the major's
Hundreds of
expression,
accounts from
not
multiple
anger or
sources
fear,
confirm
but
it.
something else.
The question isn't
Something
whether it
darker.
happened.
The
After 10
question
minutes,
is what it
Major
means.
Harrison approached Mitchell
Perhaps
directly.
it means that human nature is
Said
not
they
fixed.
needed documentation of a
That
specific
were not
site.
inherently good or evil.
Said the
but
scene
capable
required
of both
official
depending on
photographic
circumstances.
evidence. Said
That
it would be
systems
difficult
matter
but
more
necessary.
than individuals.
Mitchell
That a
asked what
German
kind of
soldier
site.
in a Nazi uniform
The
could
major
still
didn't
choose
answer
mercy,
directly,
while an American guard
just
in a
said to bring
democratic
extra
army
film
could
and
choose
prepare
cruelty.
for unpleasant work.
That war doesn't
They
reveal who
drove
we
3
truly
miles
are.
south in a jeep.
It reveals who we
The
become
major,
under extreme
Mitchell,
pressure.
and 2 infantry
And
sergeants.
that sometimes, even under
Nobody
that pressure,
spoke.
we choose to be
The
human.
road passed through destroyed villages where walls still smoked.
They turned onto a farm track. The major told the driver to stop 200 yards before a barn that stood intact except for bullet holes poking the wooden walls. Mitchell smelled it before he saw it. Death. Decay. The unmistakable odor of bodies left in summer heat. His stomach tightened. The major said French civilians had reported something yesterday. Said military police investigated. Said they needed official photographic documentation before the burial detail arrived. Said Mitchell should photograph everything. Complete documentation. No censorship on these images. These needed to be preserved exactly as found. They walked toward the barn. Flies formed clouds in the doorway. Mitchell raised his camera bag instinctively, a gesture of professional preparation that felt absurd given the smell. The major stopped at the entrance. Said the scene inside showed approximately 34 civilian bodies. Said evidence indicated they had been confined in the barn and executed. Said the victims appeared to be men, women, and children from the nearby village. Said German forces had occupied this area until 4 days ago. Mitchell's hands trembled as he loaded fresh film into his camera. He was a photographer. This was documentation. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what photography meant in this context. The major asked if he was ready. Mitchell nodded because there was no alternative. They entered the barn. The bodies lay where they had fallen. Some against the walls where they had tried to press themselves into corners. Others in the center where they had huddled together. Children clutched in parents' arms. Old people with faces that showed their last moments. The killing had been methodical. Bullet wounds to heads and chests. Shell casings scattered across the floor. Bloodstains darkened the wooden planks in patterns that told the sequence, first the men who might have resisted, then the women who tried to shield children, finally the children themselves. July 9 years have passed since the war ended. A dusty road outside that caused it to have collapsed or evolved beyond
Corporal
recognition.
Thomas Mitchell carried a
The
Conta 2
soldiers who
camera
fought in
a
are
canvas
mostly
bag
gone.
alongside his rifle.
The physical
marching with the
scars
2nd
have
Canadian
healed or been
Infantry
buried
Division
with those
through
who bore them.
countryside that still smelled of
But the moral
cordite and burning
questions
timber
remain.
3 days after the British
What do we
offensive
owe our
had pushed
enemies?
German forces back from
When
the
does
city.
compassion become betrayal?
23 years old.
Can sharing food
2
with someone
years
you're
of
supposed
service.
to kill be both right and
6
wrong
months in Europe.
simultaneously? Mitchell
These
was a
questions
combat
have no
photographer
final
assigned to
answers.
document Allied
They
progress for
resurface with
intelligence
every new
assessment and
conflict.
public morale.
In Ukraine
His
today,
photographs
in
showed
Yemen,
liberation,
in Myanmar,
triumph,
in the dozen
grateful
other
French
places
civilians
where war
waving
grinds through
flags,
civilian
destroyed
populations,
German equipment,
hunger is again
advancing
weapon.
troops. Again,
Clean
soldiers
images,
and civilians faced the same
purposeful
choice.
images.
Do I
The
share
kind
my
that
food
appeared
with
in
someone on the
newspapers
other
back
side?
home with captions about
Do I
freedom
risk
and
punishment
victory?
to preserve my humanity?
His camera was government
Or
property.
do I harden my heart and survive?
His film was government controlled.
The circumstances change.
Every photograph required
The fundamental
approval before
question
development.
doesn't.
Every
The stories
developed
of World
image
War
passed
II
through
offer no
censorship.
simple lessons.
Mitchell
They
understood
don't
the
prove
rules.
that all soldiers are good
He was
or
not
that
an
war is
artist.
secretly noble.
He was a soldier
They
with
proved the
specialized
opposite.
equipment serving a specific
That war
function
is a
within
machine
the military
that forces
apparatus.
good people into terrible choices.
The summer heat pressed down
That
on the column
sometimes
of men
the only
moving
way
through
to preserve
orchards
your
where fruit
humanity
rotted
is to
on
break the
unpicked
rules
trees.
of that machine.
The Normandy
That a
campaign
piece of
had
bread
turned
can
this
be an
agricultural
agricultural region
rebellion
into
into
a
a combat
combat
zone
zone
for
for
6
6
weeks.
That we remember
Fields
the
were
battles
cratered.
and the generals, but we
Stone
should also remember the
farmhouses
small
stood with
moments
walls
of
collapsed.
unexpected compassion.
Animals lay
They
dead
tell a
and bloating
truth
in
that victory
pastures.
parades and monuments
The
cannot
civilians
express.
who remained watched from
The
doorways
bread
with
shared
hollow
between
expressions
enemies
that
during
Mitchell
World
had
War
learned not
II
to
was never
photograph.
enough. His
It
orders
didn't
were
end the
clear.
war.
Document
Didn't prevent the
military
Holocaust.
operations. Didn't stop
Focus
the
on
atomic
Allied
bombs or
strength
save
and
the
German
millions who
weakness.
died.
Avoid
It was
images
images
of
of
civilian
civilian
suffering,
suffering,
too
dead
late.
bodies, destroyed
But it
homes,
happened.
traumatized
And
populations.
it mattered.
The
To
war
people
needed
who
to
gave
look
it,
necessary,
who received it,
proportionate,
who witnessed it.
justified. It was
Mitchell's
proof that
camera
even
was
in the
a
darkest
tool for
moment of
shaping
human
the
history,
narrative.
when industrial
He
civilization
had joined the
turned
army
all
in
its power toward
1942
destruction.
believing
Some
photography would
individuals
keep him
chose
away
a
from
different
frontline
path.
combat.
Chose to
A
recognize
technical
the
specialty.
humanity of their enemies.
A safe assignment.
Chose to share what little
That
they had.
belief lasted until Normandy.
Chose hunger over hatred.
Combat photographers
That
went where the
choice
fighting
echoes
was.
across the decades. They landed with assault
Not loudly,
waves, advanced with infantry,
not dramatically,
documented battles as they
just
unfolded,
quietly,
insistently.
The difference
refusing
between
to
a
be
combat
forgotten.
photographer
and a
a
combat
reminder
soldier
that
was
war
minimal.
doesn't have to define us
Both
completely.
carried weapons. That even when
Both
everything
faced
is broken,
enemy fire.
we can still choose how we
The
break.
photographer just carried an
We
extra
can break
burden,
toward
the
cruelty,
camera,
or
the
we
film,
can break
the
toward
requirement
compassion.
to capture evidence while
The bread
surviving.
we share with enemies might
Mitchell's
not save the
photographs
world.
from D-Day showed landing
but it
craft
might save
approaching
us.
beaches, troops
From
advancing
becoming the
inland,
monsters that
prisoners
war
being
wants us to be.
processed.
From
Standard
losing the part of
documentation
ourselves that makes us human.
Good composition.
From forgetting that the person
bodies
starving in
visible.
front of us is also someone's
No
child,
blood.
someone's beloved,
No faces
someone who knows
contorted
the
in
same
death.
empty ache in their stomach.
Those
that we know.
images existed on his
The
contact
soldiers who
sheets,
shared
but
their
never
last
made it
piece of
past
bread
the
with
censors.
enemies are mostly forgotten.
The public would see courage
No
and
monuments
determination.
honor them, not horror and waste.
No medals were awarded.
By July,
History
Mitchell
had
had moved
developed
on
a
to bigger
photographer's
stories,
instinct
for what would be
but
approved.
their
choice remains.
Upward angles that
A
made
quiet
soldiers
testimony
look
to the
heroic.
possibility of compassion
Distant
in
shots that
impossible
obscured
circumstances.
individual suffering.
A reminder that
Compositions
humanity
that
persists
emphasized
even when everything
equipment
says it
tactics
should,
rather than human cost.
That hunger can make
He
enemies
was becoming
recognize their
efficient at
shared
his job,
suffering, which meant becoming
That
efficient
bread,
at selective
the most
truth.
basic food, can
The
become
column
the most
halted at a
profound
crossroads
symbol.
where two military
Not
police
of victory
officers
or
were directing
defeat,
traffic,
but of recognition.
Mitchell's unit commander,
That
Major
across the
Harrison,
battlefield,
spoke with
there
the
is another
MPs
human
briefly,
being.
then returned looking disturbed.
And hunger makes no distinction
He gathered
between
the
us.
officers for a quiet conversation. Mitchell noticed the major's expression, not anger or fear, but something else. Something darker. After 10 minutes, Major Harrison approached Mitchell directly. Said they needed documentation of a specific site. Said the scene required official photographic evidence. Said it would be difficult but necessary. Mitchell asked what kind of site. The major didn't answer directly. Just said to bring extra film and prepare for unpleasant work. They drove 3 miles south in a jeep. The major, Mitchell, and 2 infantry sergeants. Nobody spoke. The road passed through destroyed villages where walls still smoked. They turned onto a farm track. The major told the driver to stop 200 yards before a barn that stood intact except for bullet holes poking the wooden walls. Mitchell smelled it before he saw it. Death. Decay. The unmistakable odor of bodies left in summer heat. His stomach tightened. The major said French civilians had reported something yesterday. Said military police investigated. Said they needed official photographic documentation before the burial detail arrived. Said Mitchell should photograph everything. Complete documentation. No censorship on these images. These needed to be preserved exactly as found. They walked toward the barn. Flies formed clouds in the doorway. Mitchell raised his camera bag instinctively, a gesture of professional preparation that felt absurd given the smell. The major stopped at the entrance. Said the scene inside showed approximately 34 civilian bodies. Said evidence indicated they had been confined in the barn and executed. Said the victims appeared to be men, women, and children from the nearby village. Said German forces had occupied this area until 4 days ago. Mitchell's hands trembled as he loaded fresh film into his camera. He was a photographer. This was documentation. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what photography meant in this context. The major asked if he was ready. Mitchell nodded because there was no alternative. They entered the barn. The bodies lay where they had fallen. Some against the walls where they had tried to press themselves into corners. Others in the center where they had huddled together. Children clutched in parents' arms. Old people with faces that showed their last moments. The killing had been methodical. Bullet wounds to heads and chests. Shell casings scattered across the floor. Bloodstains darkened the wooden planks in patterns that told the sequence, first the men who might have resisted, then the women who tried to shield children, finally the children themselves.